I see her at various ethics and rally events, but we don't actually get together. Do you know her well?
Yeah, I mean, I spent 4 months there, and she came to see me in Cape Town maybe 7 years before.
All right.
And so, and we've always been talking about doing something at ECT and whatnot, but we've never really done anything.
No.
So, Jackie's one of these, well, we're all just so busy that it's just...
They're all very busy, yes, certainly.
It's crazy.
So this has finally come up, good. Great.
So I hear there's a TRC type thing going on in UCT.
Shackville TRC. We have to keep you informed of what's going on.
You don't want to
No,
be.
I don't want to be informed. UCT is just so depressing.
Is it? Why?
Yeah, it is at the moment.
Why?
That's what we could talk about.
But I'm going to get all esoteric because I think there's just like so much darkness
That
there.
I got shut out when I'm here.
And you know that Peterson has gone to Free State as the Vice Chancellor.
He got,
Oh, really?
He got appointed at UFS as Vice Chancellor.
Oh, really?
Which is not a good thing, right? The average lifespan of a Vice Chancellor in South Africa is about 2 years. Nobody wants the job anymore.
And Takela is living as well.
Yeah, but to Forte, that's nice.
Yeah.
He's happy.
I might follow him to Fort Hill.
I might follow him to 48 too.
At home.
You can start your from there.
Forte's actually...
Especially because most of the people that are interesting that should have work is actually from Forte.
But Forte is quite disorganized.
And all the NSFAS money goes missing, like every year, like millions of it.
Yeah, the previous Vice Chancellor is in trouble
Is he though? Is someone actually holding him accountable for all that money? Or is it
for
just...
that 10 million
Yeah.
spent. Well, I think it's in the courts.
I never hear anything about it, and like in
Spent
the...
on what? What did they do with it?
It was a corruption thing around the raises. He was meant to build some raises, and then either he got like somebody he knew to build it, or it got delayed. But it's very unclear.
But also they take all the bribes with the NSFAS and stuff. So they had that huge NSFAS scandal. So all the money was just going...
Sakela's going to have a lot of stuff to
Yeah.
sort out before he can just be the Vice Chancellor.
That's a problem.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the populist stuff, presumably on Thursday night.
I haven't even thought of my questions, but I did get your email.
I'm sure you could stand up and speak fluently for as long as it's fluently too long. 9 years. She's very fluent. It'll be fun. It'll be a fun occasion, actually. I think it's
Well, no, thank you for organising it.
everything else is sort of
Of course, they can keep me in that picture.
People say they're happy to talk and...
They've got 9 of you.
You'll
I
be
didn't
the
take
next
the
Nine, well, we
picture.
could have more, but we've got 9 countries, like people I knew who were coming anyway,
Yeah.
from countries which had experienced recent relevant populist upheavals.
Yeah.
And I think, South Africa has interesting
Did you miss
things
it, Jane?
No.
if you haven't had your populist
I'm
upheaval yet,
still
but
having
maybe
to have my time.
We
interesting
might
question.
I've been in the
be having
library
it.
today.
Well, that's
For example,
so.
I
Well,
just
no,
wasted
I
the
mean,
whole
Jacob
day
Zuma is a
reading
populist.
something I should have
Well, that's part of the problem in some ways. He is in, well,
I
we can
mean,
talk
at
about
the end of the day, I'm like,
But the other
oh,
interesting
did I
thing
really
is
have
that,
to do this? But
Italy's gone that way now.
I
Last
wouldn't
week,
have
last election
such
gone that
time.
route.
So,
And,
so now
I mean, I was just
can
determined
know
not
what
to
I
have
need
another
read
Trump
and what I-
Trump wake, because everyone's talking about Trump, but this is an international conference. I do not want to be dominated by Trump. But on the other hand, Trump is part of a larger
Just on
issue.
the
Yeah.
space to think through and not have to
I,
deal with all of the stuff.
I put the TV on when I got in last night at about 9 o'clock. And
Yeah,
all
exactly.
that I've been watching is Trump analysis.
I know. It's crazy. I mean, people are going completely wild. That's giving him fantastic amount of publicity.
Well, and then his whole family, actually. Today it was all about Ivanka Trump and what
I
she's
know.
going to be doing and
That's right.
moving to Washington and. So how have you been taking American politics?
No, that's another depressing man.
Are you okay?
So I just stay with my book.
Yeah, he's just in the library. He's just locked in the library.
I just stay with my book. And here I'm not compelled to say anything, right? So nobody knows who I am.
Except for
nobody
when
cares.
things happen
So I
that-
just just watch.
You get a little bit compelled when things happen back at UCT. When
You
there's
think-
open letters sent to departments. and
No, you've been very quiet.
I don't get involved.
You were involved the other day.
Where?
With Loazi's.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Message of support.
Yeah, that was nice.
We will be with my mentor. No, it's fine. It's fine.
He's still going through the most. They won't let it go. He's still like in this tribunal.
I just wonder if they will give him, what's his name? He's on probation.
Loisy.
He's senior supervisor.
They'll probably deny him probation on the grounds of uncollegiality.
Did Anthony resign, or just resign as head of department?
Never resigned.
No, he said it in the newspaper that he'd resigned as head of department
No,
after Loisy's.
no, I can't remember exactly, but
He didn't.
he did it. I think it was just something that was spread out to fan, or at least to fan the flames of Loisy's story, of Loisy's letter. Because he's got one more year till it's all like till the next person.
Must coming anyway.
Must coming anyway.
Yeah.
So
Anthony Butler.
Anthony Butler. Yeah. The staff has been quite absent this year, whereas with Rhodes School, the staff were present.
So he'll start in a couple of minutes and just give people a chance to turn up.
You mean you staff members? Staff members?
Yeah. And the Black Academic Caucus, people have been absent. There's been no teachings, there's been no mentoring. Katie has been involved in one or two of the plenaries at Beaker House.
part of it is because they've started turning on
academics.
On academics now.
So it doesn't matter who you are, they're starting to turn on you.
And they have like mock trials
student protesters,
where they,
the school
for
protesters.
example, bring up
There's a whole
and
student
then
movement
problematize
protest
everything that
Oh,
is
right.
as well. So if the university is not going to take decolonization into its hands, we're going to do it ourselves. So they'll have like a they'll like reevaluate your work.
Anybody else want to? Just a question of time.
Yeah,
it's
so
done
the
at
four
Hibbing.
of my students, it would be great for them to come.
Of course.
But I don't just know, I think Claire's being
Bash
taken
it
home.
to you.
Okay, fine. So let's start.
Just
But I'll obviously.
First years.
Hello, everybody. Come closer.
Yeah, first of all, come closer. But secondly, as it's a small group, why don't we all briefly introduce ourselves? Because there's such a small number of us. It'd be quite nice to know who we are, and hopefully we'll have lively discussions. So we know who Sharlene is, and I'll tell you anyway if you didn't know, because I have a biography of her. So why don't we just go around and say who we are. I'm Helen Hayes. I'm visiting professor here. I've been here visiting professor here for quite a long time. And I'm currently co-chair of this imminent conference that I hope you're going to be coming to, which is certainly very challenging. And my extremely able assistant administrator on the whole thing. He's my assistant, he's my boss really, but Brent, say who you are.
Hi, I'm Brent Mayer. I'm a fourth-year doctoral student here and help with AME and also CMES.
And Chris is also on our team of the conference teams that introduced yourself.
So welcome. I'm really happy that you're all here for this amazing conference and for Sharlene's talk. My name is Krista Goldstein-Cole. I'm a fifth-year doctoral student in human development. I'm working on my dissertation with a focus on the role of social services with its intersection with education.
Hi everyone, I'm Abiyose Bukari from currently from the University of the Western Cape, and I'm doing my Master's in International Development Studies, and yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Happy to have you.
Yeah.
I'm Nyamju. I'm from the University of Cape Town. I just completed my Master's in Justice and Transformation.
I'm Kolela from the University of Cape Town as well. I'm a visiting fellow here at the Hutchins Center.
I'm Helen Snively. I went here a long time ago. I ran the Writing Center for 10 years, and I remember you, Sharlene, from 10 minutes of looking at some proposal or something. And when I saw your name in some list, I thought, whoa, I'm coming. And your friend Magda Matache was hoping to come. I don't know where she is.
Oh, okay.
Hello from Magda anyway.
Thank you.
She's a Roma woman who's put together an amazing conference last spring about
Yeah.
reparations.
And she's at the FXB Center with Jackie Barber.
Yes,
and
exactly.
that's-
Yes.
I'm Leah. I'm an undergraduate from England. I'm here for the work experience, just to learn from everyone.
She's also working very hard, helping us with the conference as well. So. Hello?
I'm Emma. I'm at the University of Cape Town as well, doing my PhD around how our identities around like race and class specifically inform and give access to our ideas about restitution and reparations.
Hi, I'm Jessica and I'm at the University of Wits, or Wits, and I'm doing my MA in interdisciplinary sense.
I just thought that person's coming, they're not going to a different event in the next room. So. Okay, so let's now
Yeah,
move
next
on
door
to-
is something called stress relief.
That's really lovely.
That seems good.
because it's exam week, so thank you for coming. Yes. It's really great. And thank you for inviting me, Helen. So this is probably the third time I'm speaking about restitution.
Well, can I just introduce you?
Oh,
first?
sure.
I have to say wonderful things about you. So,
Okay.
well, you all know who Sharlene is. I don't have to say much more. But I have to say, I met Sharlene. We were trying to work out when I first met her. I think I met her in England when she was a doctoral student at the University of Cambridge. That must be about 12 years ago, I guess, would it be? That's right. And we've been in contact ever since on a variety of issues. And she was a student here at the Ed School. Was it 2002 or thereabouts?
Yeah, finished in
As a
2003.
master's student, and then she went on to do her doctorate at Cambridge. And I was also fascinated by what she was doing for her doctorate, because she was working for a year-long ethnographic study in townships in Kangitsa,
Langa.
in Cape Town. And whenever she talked about it, I found it so fascinating. First of all, the stamina, I think, is the way I describe it, is to manage to work in that kind of environment with all the challenges of it, and also to remain engaged both with the intellectual ideas you're developing, but also the people you're working with, and participating, getting them to participate in many ways in the project that you were researching. And I found that very, very moving and very inspiring as a researcher who likes to think about that, engaging in that way. And of course, subsequently, she's done extremely well in various academic positions, written several books. I can't remember how many, but is it 4 or 5? Something like that. Many books, which is great. Inspiration to all of us. Now, her dissertation, her discussant isn't able to be here. Is she on a plane somewhere?
Yes, she's been delayed in Dubai. So
In Dubai.
Well, that's
Yes.
a place to be delayed.
Well,
she's coming to the conference as well, and so we kind of made it.
and so I gather Kaleda
Was inveigled and
Inveigled, yes.
told to come by his wife this morning.
and he's going to give a kind of commentary on the what Sharlene's going to say. And he's a professor at UCT in sociology, writing a biography of Nelson Mandela. He's also a Harry Oppenheimer Fellow at the Hutchins Centre here. He's about to become the Emeka Anyo Oku, a visiting chair at University of London Institute for Commonwealth Studies. We're very pleased to have you. Thank you. Sharlene, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. And I wanted to say that this is the third time I'm here at the Ed School speaking about restitution. And it's pretty much been 6 years ago when I was just beginning to think about it. I did a CMEI symposium, and then 2 years ago I was just in the process of writing the book because I was on sabbatical. And Helen asked me a really insightful question. She said, Sharlene, who is this book for? And that was the question that really helped me to shape and to frame it. Because I think when we speak about something like restitution for race, for inequality, it's important to think about who you're writing a book for. So I wanted to start by showing you a short clip from Cry Freedom. Have you seen the movie? The one with Denzel Washington? Just a short clip, because I know we've got a bit of time, and so it helps us to frame why I wrote what I wrote. So Brett, over to you. Just about 7 or 8 minutes of it.
I would imagine the church, but as you know, I can only deal with one person at a time. You see, if a third person comes into the room, even to bring coffee, that breaks the ban. In the system, the police are just across the road. But of course, you would approve of my banning.
No, I think your ideas are dangerous, but no, I don't approve of banning.
A true liberal.
It's not a title I'm ashamed of, though I know you regard it with some contempt.
I just think that a white liberal who clings to all the advantages of his white world, jobs, housing, education, Mercedes, is perhaps not the person best qualified to tell blacks how they should react to apartheid.
I wonder what sort of liberal you would make, Mr. Beaker, if you were the one who had the job, the house, and the Mercedes, and the whites lived in townships.
It's a charming idea. It was good of you to come, Mr. Woods. I wanted to meet you for a long time.
Follow you everywhere. They think they do.
A clinic for black people, staffed by black people, run by a black doctor.
Is this her idea or yours?
Come on, let me show you around. It was a collective idea, but we were lucky to have that.
And the whites, liberals thought they're doing the same thing. Wouldn't serve your purpose, no.
When I was a student, trying to qualify for the jobs you people would let us have, I suddenly realized it wasn't just good jobs that were white. The only history we read was made by the white man, written by the white man. Televisions, cars, medicines, all invented by the white man, even football. Now, in a way like that, it's not hard to believe there's something inferior about being born black. We grow most of our food, yeah, for the patients and some of the staff.
The church?
Oh, that was here long before us. But I began to think this idea of inferiority was an even bigger problem for us than what the Afrikaners were doing to us. That first, the black man had to believe he had as much capacity to be a doctor and a leader as a white man. So we tried to set this place up. My own mistake was to put some of those ideas down on paper.
The government banned you.
And the fighting liberal editors started attacking me.
I attacked you for being racist.
How old are you, Mr. Woods?
41, if that makes any difference.
Ah. A white South African. 41 years old, a newspaper man. Have you ever spent any time in a black township?
I've been to many.
No, don't be embarrassed. Except for the police, I don't think one white South African in 10,000 has. You see, we know how you live. We cut your lawns, we cook your food, clean your rubbish. How would you like to see how we live? The 90% of your fellow countrymen who have to get off your white streets at 6 o'clock at night.
You really think this is worth the risk?
The education of a white liberal.
If you get caught out of your banning area, well, all he might have to do is write a letter to his board of directors. I don't want them to get you in a jail.
Now look, I was born in a tribal homeland, Transkei. My dad had a store there. Not half as uncomfortable as you think.
As a liberal, if you had your way, you'd be riding buses and taxis, just like us.
Well, you tell me my days of white privilege are numbered, so I'm enjoying them while I can.
Run, son, run. It's a miracle a child survives here at all. Most of the women who have work permits are domestic maids. So they only get to see their kids for a couple of hours on Sundays. Place is full of drunks, thuggery. People so desperate for anything they'll beat a kid bloody if they thought he had 5 guns.
Was that kid you a few years ago?
Yeah. Maybe more scared. But if you do run fast enough, if you do survive, you grow up in these streets, these houses. Your parents tried, but in the end, You only get the education the white man will give. Then you go to the city to work or shop. You see their streets, their cars, their houses, and you begin to feel there is something not quite right about yourself, about your humanity, something to do with your blackness. Because no matter how dumb or smart a white child is, he's born into that world. But you, the black child, smart or dumb, you're born into this. And smart or dumb, you're dying. It's very
Oops. They put it on and then leave it on, right? I think that's what it does.
I am.
So, I start this book by talking about my first trip that I took to London in 1988. The film was made in 1987. And it tells the story of Donald Woods and Steve Biko's friendship with each other. And it also gives us an outline of Steve Biko's life. It was in about 1973, 1974. And Steve Biko died shortly after the Soweto uprising. So I start the book by talking a little bit about what watching the film had meant to me when I arrived in London. But then I continue to tell about a little incident where I crossed the channel from the UK to Switzerland, and I took a train one winter afternoon up a hill into a little farm area, and I got lost. And so everywhere I looked, I saw only shadows and trees, and I'm just going to read a few paragraphs. I walked bravely towards some lights and was relieved to find a small farmhouse, and I marched up to the door, removed my gloves, and knocked loudly. A large white-haired bearded man with a red bulbous nose opened the door. I greeted him politely in my best Swiss German, told him I was lost, and asked whether he could point me into the direction of the train station. I was worried that he would not understand me, since all I spoke was English after the initial, good evening. But he did. Gruffly he said, "Speak more," and I did. I can't remember what I said exactly, but then he asked, "South African?" ? And I eagerly responded, "Yes, South African." And I expected the usual travel banter about rugby in Table Mountain. Instead, he glared at me and he yelled, "Apartheid!" And he spat on my snow-covered boots and slammed the door in my face. My coldness and my lostness were nothing in comparison to the confusion and the deep shame I felt, because at that moment here I was, in a village in the middle of nowhere, and a man who looked like Father Christmas refused to help me find the train station because I was a white South African. That moment has given me many years of pause for thought, but it was the beginning of a profound consciousness of my country, what had happened to it, and what responsibility I bore for changing it. It wasn't my first awareness of race or racism or injustice, but it was the first time I realized the enormity of what it truly means to be a white South African. So in many regards, that clip and that the film Cry Freedom really has framed some of my subsequent life and work in academia and personally. So if you just move on with the slides, thanks, Brett. Or I've got this the pointer, right? So I could just do it. There we go. So what I want to do today is tell you a little bit about what's in the book and why I wrote it and where it comes from. And it's pretty much why restitution, what is restitution, and how to do restitution from this perspective, and framed by what I understand about Steve Biko's friendship with Donald Woods. Because in many regards, what is it that black consciousness teaches? It teaches that black South Africans particularly are sufficient and don't need the help of white people to be human, be equal, bring about reform and change. And so the function of white South Africans must be to think about their own privilege and then to relinquish that privilege in part of becoming an equitable society. So what this book does, and in answer to Helen's question that she posed 2 years ago for me, is who is this book for? Well, I think it's meant to raise the consciousness level of white South Africans. Colella had said to me 2 years ago at the same time when I was here at Harvard that we really need to be speaking of white consciousness. And we need to be talking about consciousness of blackness, and white South Africans and white people in the world need to be talking about that. And so it's been interesting the last 2 years, because with the rise of Black Lives Matter, with the rise of so many other movements that want to draw attention to the inequality that we're experiencing in the world, it seemed like a timeless thing. So the book, framed really by some of this idea that Steve Biko, for all of his proposing of black consciousness, of it's not time for a non-racial future yet, because we first need to talk amongst ourselves as black people in South Africa, as white people, before we can head towards a non-racial future. We can't start talking about race not mattering, or we're just members of the human race, or we colorblind, because it really it helps us to turn a blind eye to the injustice that continues in our world. And so, because this is a civic and moral education initiative seminar, I thought I'd frame it by talking about how I propose that this happen. And for me, it's about dialogue, but it's not dialogue that says we stop doing what we ought to be doing while we talk. It's dialogue while we do the things to bring about a more equitable society. So one of the things that I did in the book is I interviewed 60 people, and I asked them questions like you see up on the screen behind you. How has the past affected your life? Now, if you think about that for a minute, if you're a black South African and you're living in 2014, how has the past affected your life? A history of subjugation, of apartheid laws. Well, it's almost it's shaped your life in so many ways, from an education point of view, from a job reservation point of view, all the things that Biko talk about in the film, in that short clip. That's what it does. And as a white South African, if you answer that question, you can say, like many of my respondents said, well, not really. My life is no different to what it was before 94. I live in a big house. My parents have got secure jobs. We have land. We own houses. Nothing much has actually changed, except that democratically I am technically equal to a black South African, whereas that wasn't true in the past under the apartheid system. And so the dialogue then goes on to ask people to talk about other questions like, what is the meaning of this word restitution, which is quite a difficult word. I've always thought of it as quite a loud and provocative word. It's not reconciliation. It's all just get on better. It's not even more the legal term of reparations. It's actually a very noisy word. It doesn't allow you just to go, well, you know, it's all very well. So the conversations carry on. We speak about locating yourself. Were you a victim? Were you a perpetrator? Were you something else? And I want to show you a little video clip in a few minutes. And then maybe talking about ideas for restoring our humanity, if we can understand that apartheid was really part of destroying the fabric of our humanity. For white South Africans to believe themselves to be superior was an injury to a sense of humanity, because it's not true. And for black South Africans to be considered, or to have the government consider themselves to be inferior, was an injury to humanity. So how do we restore this humanity? So what I did in these interviews is what I really come up with in the book as this could be a dialogue for how we take things forward. So the next slide is literally just a picture of my cell phone. And what I had a student of mine do is to develop an app that will allow people to have these kinds of dialogues. And you really could download it even as I speak. It's a small app, and it's available on both the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. And what it does is it just, it says, here are questions that will cover 10 weeks. And they're not very difficult questions. They are deeply, I think they could be deeply moving questions and deeply profound questions. But they're questions like, how has the past affected your life? What is the difference between charity and restitution? What is your vision for South Africa in 2016? And what should we do to make restitution? And the idea behind the app is to say, or the dialogue is to say, choose 10 people different to you and meet for 10 weeks. Make a commitment to meet for 10 weeks. And in those 10 weeks, have these 10 discussions that talk about the need for restitution in a place like South Africa. But at the same time, I'm quite aware that a lot of the things that I'm proposing in the book are equally applicable all around the world where injustice has occurred, and where injustice has occurred based on race, but also based on sexuality, based on gender and patriarchy, based on how we treat immigrants in our country. I mean, I think there's a lot of resonance for an idea of restitution. So, for me, the idea is frame restitution as a dialogue between people who are dissimilar to you and come up with some answers. But there's some other really hard evidence that we can give people when it comes to talking about why restitution. And the first is the huge levels of inequality, not just in South Africa, but all over the world, which we can't deny. And I've got 10 or 12 facts on that slide, but maybe just one that I want to draw your attention to. Most of you will be familiar with the Human Development Index, an index that your own, Amartya Sen, developed with others in the United Nations Development Program. And what it does is it measures the level of human development, and the index consists of three factors. The one is income levels, the second is education levels, and the third is life expectancy. So in South Africa, South Africa is 116th on that level of the Human Development Index. So out of maybe about 160 or 70 countries who calculate the Human Development Index, we're kind of, in the lower third. If you just remove white South Africans and you measure the HDI for white South Africans, we are 15th. So in one sense, that's a really big difference, and it really is something that many white South Africans, if you ask them today and you did some interviews, would go, no, that's not possible. That's not true. Our lives are worse. It's tough. Our incomes are gone, affirmative action, all of that kind of thing. The problem is that it is true. Those are the figures from HDI. Some people disaggregated it by race, and that's the answer. 15th is the same living standard as Sweden, and it's exactly the same as the UK, and it's better than France, and it's better than Belgium. And people don't believe that either, but actually these are the hard statistics. All those other statistics on that slide behind you are also very real. A 20-year differential in life expectancy between black and white South Africans. White South African kids between the ages of 18 and 22 are 7 times more likely to go to university than black South African kids. Things like optimism. So this is the thing that I always find really interesting, is black South Africans are twice as optimistic about the future as white South Africans, even with all this inequality that I'm showing on the screen. And another interesting statistic just below it, where white South Africans are twice as in favor of redistribution as black South Africans. And what is underneath that is that most black South Africans, certainly when I did the interviews and when some of those surveys were done, talk about not particularly wanting redistribution, but actually just wanting an ability to access opportunities like white South Africans have. Now, there's been a shift in our country in the last 2 years. I did these interviews in 2014, and when I asked the question, what is your vision for South Africa, the answer was, we want a vision where we are equal, where poverty and inequality is a thing of the past, where race doesn't define our future or our lives, and when we have neighbors and we live next door to people who are different to us, and it's not a big deal. But at the moment, South Africa is not that. And then the opposite part of the question was, what will happen if nothing more is done about our past? And the answer was, the country will burn, there will be revolution, it can't just go on as usual. And in the past 2 years, what's happened is, there've always been what we call euphemistically in South Africa service delivery protests. communities saying this is not good enough, we don't really have the services, the sanitation, the housing that we were promised in '94. But in the last 2 years, students have drawn attention to the fact of economic inequality, but they've used some vehicles on campus. They've spoken about fees and access to education being free, and they've also coupled a lot of that to the wage regime of workers on campus. And so they've used two focal points, but really they're drawing attention to the wider inequalities in society. And that's been going on now since March 2015. So what I do in the book is I capture a moment just before the students have highlighted these inequalities, and those protests are continuing and will probably continue in our country for the next 10 or 20 years. So why restitution? Well, because we have a deeply unequal society. We have a playing field that's tilted. Somebody asked me if that's a real picture. No, it's not. It's a Photoshop picture. And so we forget to, and I think one of the things that I found in the book is that both black and white South Africans don't talk very easily of the fact that our history of apartheid legislation, of totalitarian legislation, is really the thing that has brought us to this point of inequality. We seem to divorce our history from our current circumstances. So people understand that we're an unequal society, but they don't really, they're reluctant to lay the blame on the past. And I think that's something that came out from the interviews that I did in the book. So a common vision for South Africa. I think sometimes people mistake the fact that we want all the same things, but we've got these huge incidents of racism that keep coming up. We've got huge issues and problems in South Africa where people say, again, around the student protests, that it doesn't seem like people want what we want, is really what I'm hearing students saying and what I'm hearing in the book. So just a couple of comments. Emma, why don't you just read it for me? I can't read from the back of my head.
So you'll no longer be able to say a black person will be a cleaner and a white person will be the CEO when there are black and white people who are poor and black and white people who are rich. So that's in Bali, who's a black woman financial administrator. And the second quote, when for the majority of the people poverty is not due to apartheid, when a person is able to rise out of poverty through hard work and talent, not connections or affirmative actions. Pelesa, black woman financial administrator.
Okay. And so what is Another Country about? It's about telling these stories from black and white South Africans about how the past remains present in our current lives, talking about what we could do to make things right, trying to unpack this word restitution and trying to give it a deeper meaning, from making things right or restoring to its original condition, which is something that's really hard to do, if not impossible, to coming up with a newer and fresher definition of restitution, and then offering this idea about dialogue as a place to begin, but dialogue that must also have action that is accompanied by action. My research methodology, I did 60 interviews with people, youngest was I think 21 and the oldest 72. I'm doing this all from memory, right? And just one interview, but also a few interactive activities where I got people to, for example, I got them to choose some labels about how they relate to the past. So I've got a little video clip that I wanted to show you. So Brett, if you could do the next little video clip, and I don't think I'll even put the lights off for this one. It's just a 3-minute clip.
When speaking about injustice, we are used to hearing of two actors, a victim and a perpetrator. Just after the Jewish Holocaust and the Second World War, thanks to Raoul Hilberg, we began to speak of three actors, no longer just victims and perpetrators, but also bystanders, those who stood by and did nothing while injustice occurred. When speaking about injustice in the South African context, there are still problems with only having these three labels, and with the labels themselves. Firstly, very few people like to call themselves victims. They say it makes them feel weak and disempowered. For this reason, I added other words to describe what it must be like to suffer injustice, words such as dishonoured, harmed, or damaged by experiences of injustice. When it comes to the label perpetrator, few people are brave enough to own up to committing injustice, and few people could be said to have directly committed an injustice. In the South African context, people like Cecil John Rhodes and H.F. Verwoerd are easily recognized as being perpetrators of injustice. But under colonialism and apartheid, most people merely followed unjust laws in South Africa. For example, they went to the army to defend the apartheid regime, or accepted jobs unfairly reserved for them, or went to school heavily subsidized by government just because they were white. When it comes to injustice, it's therefore important to distinguish between those who designed injustice, an architect perpetrator, and those who went along with injustice, an implementer perpetrator. When it comes to the label bystander, this word often seems distant and few are able to identify with it. People might be more likely to admit to doing nothing if the words ostrich, silent, or avoider are used. But even adding these new descriptions still does not allow everyone in South Africa today to locate themselves in the conversation about injustice. I would suggest that two new categories are needed. The first is that of resistor, those who opposed injustice then and those who still oppose injustice today. And like the category of perpetrator, we can distinguish between someone who planned and led resistance as an architect of resistance, like Nelson Mandela and Lillian Ngoyi, and those who followed their lead, an implementer of resistance. The second new category to add is that of beneficiary, those who benefited from injustice, although they may not even have been alive at the time. Beneficiaries may also include those who benefited from resistance to injustice, or redress because of injustice. There's lots to discuss about this point, I'm sure. However, just changing the triangle to a pentangle and adding new words to describe each category gives more people an opportunity to locate themselves and join in the very important conversation about injustice, and therefore also a conversation about restitution.
So what I found with these kind of widened number of labels is that as soon as you gave people many more options beyond the victim perpetrator, suddenly the discussion got a lot more animated. So in the class that I teach, 19, 20-year-olds, maybe 22-year-olds, and a few older people, as soon as you start talking about a resistor or a beneficiary, suddenly the discussion becomes, really animated. And as soon as you start speaking about perhaps a beneficiary of redress, what does it mean to be someone who benefits from affirmative action, for example? What happens? And so there's a lot of discussion and debate. And people disagree, they agree, but what they don't do is withdraw themselves from the conversation. They laugh when you use the label ostrich, but then they start to think about it. And so there's many occasions where in the book I'm talking to people who say, oh no, I was nothing. But after a while, you give them a whole lot of more labels, and suddenly they say, actually, I'm a victim. I was hurt by the dishonor both then and now. I'm hurt by the indignity that my parents suffered. I'm hurt by the fact that I have to prove myself, that I have to work twice as hard just because I'm a person, a black person who's a motorbike rider, or I'm a black person who's an artist trying to show myself, try to bring myself into. So I suppose the thing for me that was really important was it was important for people to locate themselves in the conversation. And then the other thing that I did in the book, which I found really hard to do, but my publisher kind of pushed me to do, was to insert my own story, to talk about when I was 5 years old and how I didn't see race. But by the time I was 8 or 9 or 10 and 11 and 12, I'd become quite entitled. And the way that I treated, for example, our cleaning lady. And so I tell some of those stories, not because I wanted to be an act of confession or a purging of my own guilt, but because one of the things that it shows is the cycle of consciousness about race and racism as you grow up. And so for a white South African who I think is my primary audience for the book, it was important for me to show that every time something happens, you remember and you almost vow to do something. But like Steve Biko says to Donald Woods, but you don't really give up your good job and your Mercedes, and you stand away from people's lives and you pontificate about what should be done rather than being more and more involved. And so the story for me, every chapter in a sense, is a story about a cycle of consciousness, how when I was 21 and my shoes were spat on in Switzerland, suddenly that was a really big piece of conscious raising. But when I was 27 and the TRC was happening, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I wrote in the register that I was going to do better and that I was going to work towards justice in the country, it was a reminder that those are the things that I needed to do. And the reason why I put that part of my story in the book is because I think that there are many white South Africans who cycle in and out of consciousness. And I think that's the generous interpretation of things. So you tell people stories, you do what Donald Woods, what Steve Biko did with Donald Woods, is you show people just how inequality is lived in everyday life in the township. And certainly these stories are stories that show and demonstrate that, and you help white South Africans see how their privilege hasn't dissipated since democracy. So that's really important. And you ask people to locate themselves in these categories of victim, perpetrator, and whatnot. And we talk about what restitution, I certainly talk about what restitution has begun in South Africa, but we take it a bit further. Talk a little bit about the obstacles to restitution, how people believe that the TRC was the act of restitution and reconciliation in South Africa, but really it was only the beginning. This issue of people wanting to move on. One of the statistics that I showed initially was this 66% of South Africans of all color believe that we should just forget the past and move on in spite of the inequality that we experience. This issue of believing that government needs to take the lead, but because we've got problems with corruption, you know, how do we expect anything from government, but also how do we expect everyday people to do anything when there's so much corruption in the country? And I can say something more about corruption a bit later. Then this issue of, you know, if we start making restitution, it'll be like the camel in the tent and we don't really want to relinquish our privilege. So these were all the answers that people came up with, and they're really helpful because people can almost see themselves in a mirror. Conflating charity with restitution. South Africa is a big giver, big giving society, but charity is what you do out of your excess. It's kind of the noblesse oblige. It's not a duty or a moral duty. And then the issue of denying responsibility and benefit. And one of the big issues in South Africa is for white South Africans to say, but I worked for what I have. And the answer is really a thing, it's like we're running a 400-meter race, but you actually had a 300-meter head start. So yeah, you maybe did run 100 meters, but your head start was so enormous that it's almost impossible for people to catch up. Not completely impossible, but really hard. So in the book, lots of people, white South Africans who didn't really see clearly, who didn't want to see, who saw in distorted ways, and also very many black South Africans who saw clearly, but some older South Africans, black South Africans who didn't see clearly, who also spoke about this meritocracy issue of if we only worked hard, things would change. The last 2 years have been a spate of racist incidents in South Africa that have made the news, and so people have responded very negatively to that. And there's new legislation that's on the cards, human rights court cases and criminal court cases. And then during the student protest last year, there was that bottom picture where students started wearing T-shirts that said, "Fuck white South Africans," or "Fuck white supremacy." And there was a huge outcry about that. Is that racist? Must it be stopped? Must it be condoned? And just starting a whole new conversation about what white privilege means and what needs to happen around it. So quite a busy year or 2 years in South African democracy in the last little while. Stories of racism, stories of privilege. That's certainly the issues that the book goes through, and I won't read those to you. And then a little piece where what I do is I take one person's story and I say, so how did apartheid affect your life in actual money, in monetary terms? So Haley's a 42-year-old priest who I spent quite a bit of time listening to her story, and I did a few sums. So the sums are quite interesting just for the fact that in 1960s, 1970s, we had forced removals where black people who were living in parts of South Africa were removed to what was then called the township areas, and so land was reserved for white South Africans and not for black South Africans.
So I did some sums, and what is the value? What has she lost in monetary terms? Not in dignity, not in lost opportunities for employment, but just in monetary terms for land. And so she was removed from a suburb in Cape Town to about 45 kilometers away from the city. And so the bottom line figure is that the value of the land that she might have owned versus the value of the land that she now owns is about 3 million rand. And so she's got 3 siblings, so if you divide that by 3, because that's what she would have inherited, the cost to her, just in terms of land, is about 1 million rand. Now, the stories will be so different depending on where you move from and where you move to, but that's quite an important difference. Then there's another story that she told me is about, we've got a land claims court that is progressing quite slowly, and people go, but restitution is happening through land claims. And the reason, and then one of the things that I find out here is her grandfather had 2 farms in the Eastern Cape. They went through the land claims process and they got paid out the princely sum of about 17,000 rand. And then a couple of months later, they got a letter saying that they'd been overpaid and they had to return half the money. And so they got paid the equivalent of about $1,000 for 2 farms, which is really horrific. And she shared it with her parents. Now, some land claims are higher than that, but really the story is that the Land Claims Commission is not really making the kinds of restitution that would make for an egalitarian society, or that would restore things not to what they were, but at least make something good or make something better of the injustice of the past. And then the last story is something that people still don't believe, and I still find difficult to believe, but I went and did the research, and it's pretty true. So in the Second World War, South Africans fought for the Queen of England, and black South Africans, white South Africans, coloured South Africans, and when they came back, what did they receive as a reward? Well, white South Africans received a parcel of land, and often they received what was a cheap parcel of land, because it was on the coastal areas quite far out of Cape Town, which is now prime holiday estate. It's like the Hamptons. And if you were a coloured South African, you got a bicycle. And if you were a black South African, the Queen thanked you for your service in the war by giving you a Bible. So, yeah, I mean, it's laughable. It's so unjust. And so it's the basis for a lot of the ongoing and perpetuating equality in our country. So one person's story that illustrates the insufficiencies of the Land Claims Court, the way that apartheid can really translate itself into physical monetary terms. And so if somebody said, what restitution in financial terms is owed to this person, Haley? Well, it's about 2 million rand. But just in land and property terms, not in lost opportunities and all those kinds of things. And I think that's important, that we start to think also about the injustice in monetary terms. And I don't want to go on much longer, but white South Africans did talk about the shame of the complicity in the past, the deference that black people still treat them with. And so there is senses of shame, anger, guilt, injustice, anger that parents didn't act more against apartheid. Those are all things that I think come out quite well in people's stories, and just quite a few quotes that talk about that. And and then what I do is I take 2 chapters where I talk about restitution, and how restitution through the courts is about gain stripping and about compensation and reparations, and that must happen. And that's not, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that mustn't happen. For me, what I've described as social restitution is more of a moral responsibility. And so for me, it fits really well into civic and moral education. It's a moral duty, a moral obligation, I think, to talk about what restitution is needed and what must happen. And for me, the definition is just that. Anya, won't you read it for me, please?
Social restitution are voluntary acts and attitudes towards making good what our past history of injustice has damaged. It is forward-looking restitution for individuals and communities to pursue as a moral responsibility rather than as a legal liability. It invites all parties to acknowledge the past and to work together to repair it through symbolic and material actions. The motive is our shared humanity, and the goal is a restored personhood of all involved.
And what I've done with this notion of a shared humanity or a restitution of personhood is I've just married the kind of theorizing that Frantz Fanon does around dignity and restoring of dignity, that includes land and that includes material possessions and the ability to determine your own future, with Nancy Fraser's ideas around recognition of the other and whatnot. So the restitution of personhood is something that I talk about, that explain a video that I've just spoken a little bit about, and where we go from there in terms of remembering the past so that we can actually better move forward. And then I suppose finally what the book does is it offers a whole bunch of ideas that people who I interviewed came up with. And what I've done in the app is I've put those ideas in, but as people have these discussions, the idea would be that they would come up with more ideas for social restitution, and that it would generate in the app the ideas to take forward. And so the way I want to just end is by saying my offering of this book as social restitution, everyday social restitution, is not by any means the answer to a country like South Africa's problems and inequalities and injustices of the past, but I think it's one piece in the arsenal. Students often say to me, so what is the role of protest? And I think for me, protest is really important because it makes the issue more urgent. This is almost a gentle ask of people, of white South Africans especially, to come together, to have dialogues, try and understand how the inequalities have come to be and what needs to be done about it. But revolution or protest almost needs to make that more urgent and more compelling. So the one you do as a voluntary obligation, the other you do because otherwise there will be something more dire and sinister waiting. And then there's the role of government, and through the courts, restitution that must happen there. And then there's also restitution that must happen through business. Business in South Africa has hugely benefited from the past injustices. And so between those four groups of people, that's really how I argue that restitution will happen in its completeness. But social restitution is one slice of that cake. So that's what the book is about. And it's both practical and, I hope, a manifesto for this thing called social restitution. So, sorry I took so long to tell you about that. But so before I ask Leila to say something about the book, is I've asked a few of my students who are here. Brought my own audience today. But Jess, what was your take on the book? And really, I'm not asking them to just say good things, right? They can also say critical things.
Hello again. So I think chapter 5 is particularly important. Chapter 5 speaks, like Sharlene has said, it's more about the response and the action that white South Africans need to take. There's a particular story that Sharlene tells in the book that I think is relevant because we actually watched it. It's in her second year race class and gender course in the sociology department. She plays Cry Freedom for the students, and afterwards she asks the students to divide themselves in the classroom into black and white, and then to discuss how racism affects them as South Africans. And I think the answer is really telling, is that the black students kind of start speaking about how racism affects them, and they start giving examples, and then the white students start speaking about how racism affects black students. And I think that's kind of, perhaps up until 2015, when the protest started, is really how white South Africans kind of viewed race as something that doesn't really affect them, as something that only really affects black people in South Africa. And I think this book, and part of the larger conversation that's happening, is causing white South Africans to reflect both on how racism affects them and how they are complicit in how racism affects others. And I think that that's really, really important. Paula, who is here, kind of says on the back that this is a response to Biko's kind of call for white people to talk about race. And again, what Sharlene said is to try, maybe see if this possibility of white consciousness is doable, it's something that we should pursue, is meaningful. And yeah, I mean, at the initial launch of this book, I must just say that I was on the panel, the person sitting next to me spoke about how what an easy read it is and how relatable all the people are that Sharlene interviews and speaks about, and how he said as he was reading the book he saw his mother and he saw his friends and his father and his brother. I actually helped Sharlene. I was her research assistant for this book, and there was a big part of interviewing intimates. So a lot of the people in the book really are my mother and my sister and my father, and that's been a really interesting part about reading it, reading their responses attached to theory, and I think it shows the realness of the race problem being a problem of white South Africans, because yeah, it was a hugely reflexive exercise for me as well.
Abiose? You have read it, right?
Yes, I did. Hi, everyone.
When I met Abiose, she told me she didn't believe in restitution because Sierra Leone is a hard place. Yeah, but a few comments, Abiose?
Yes, hi, everyone. Yes, so as Sharlene already introduced me, I'm from Sierra Leone, and we've also had talks about restitution during the TRC. Yeah, in my country after the Civil War. We had a 10-year Civil War, and many things were damaged and people died. So we made plans to come about with restitution, but it did not work out. So then I met Sharlene for the first time. She told me, okay, I was like, I don't believe in this stuff. You understand? And even when we went for the luncheon, I did the introduction, I did the presentation, and I also explained that actually, I also don't believe in restitution. But when she gave me the book that same day, I thought, okay, let me not just, say this. Let me just read what she has to say. So I read Sharlene's book about restitution, and at other points I was like, well, we are both on the same page. You understand? She was coming from another angle. So the point that really struck me was that first there was a student, I don't want to mention his name because the name was not a real name in the book, first of all, but there was a student who mentioned something that was very touching. And the touching part was that he mentioned, he was a male student, that actually when he was a young child, when he was a young boy, his mother was a domestic worker. And then the mother literally had to go down on her knees to beg her white employers not to get angry. So there was this time when he was really frightened, he was very scared of white people. Really if you see he was white, he just thinks they're gods, really gods or something. So he was very like that. And that feeling actually turned into anger, a very bitter anger. So I realized that actually, what is the difference between that feeling of, feeling, oh, these people are like gods, they look holy, they look better than us, and I'm just angry with them. You understand? What happened between that point? You understand? What made them? So I realized that actually, it was because people did not speak out about these issues, about race, and about how they felt about it at that time. So I also realized that through Sharlene's description about restitution, she made maybe really good points about how a restitution can be made. And then one of the points she mentioned, I don't remember the chapter, I think there was another part after the white page, like restitution, defining restitution, how to make restitution. And then she mentioned about the problems that comes about making restitution. The first is the definition of problem. It's quite a slippery slope. But in my own opinion, when I thought about restitution, I thought, oh, it's making things right as they were in the past. So I always related restitution back to the past. But actually, when I read her book, I could see that actually, she just used the term, just make things right. And I was like, okay, how can we make things right? Then she justified how. You understand? So I tried to see maybe how can we make things right.
Yeah.
Like if I take Sharlene's, because I'm not South African, so I cannot boast that I know about South African history. And I cannot really relate to the apartheid system in South Africa because I did not work here. So I was trying to put that situation back in my home context. You understand? Like in my context, maybe because of my gender or my race or because of my class, maybe I should have had privileges that I didn't have. And then Sharlene made a point. She made a point that actually, when people sit back and look, maybe for example, a white South African, when they sit back and they reflect and they try to engage in dialogues, and she mentioned the point mentoring, using faith-based spaces, and I came to realize that the thing that really points out in what I felt really made sense at that time was actually when people sit down and discuss about their issues. That was something that hasn't been done before. So I thought that in South Africa, like when I attended UCT, I met with many white students and many blacks, but people never sat down to talk about the issues. So, but I thought that actually that was very important. So that was the
Annie?
I have 2 endorsements and 1 criticism. The first thing is when you want to engage in some sort of program of action for change, one of the things that you should be wary of is like, as much as your efforts are noble, there's always the possibility that you're going to undermine your effort. You're going to reproduce the very thing that you're fighting against. If we look, for example, at social movements in the Arab Spring, you find at least one unfortunate consequence has been the fact, even though sometimes liberation has been temporary, people, they are nonetheless reproducing systems and patterns of oppression that the way. So I think what I like about your book is that in trying to create a space for white participation in change understood as social restitution. I mean, when usually the complaint has been that when white people try to, white people seek to participate, they're some condescending, they're patronizing, and in those behaviors end up perpetuating the very thing that they're trying to fight against.
Yeah.
So, and I think this is very much linked to the lesson that you brought out from Steve Biko, which is trying to understand what exactly is the role of a white person in remedying racial injustice. And your book focuses very much on white people having a responsibility to reflect on their privilege, but for that reflection to go beyond just merely acknowledging and also coming up with concrete efforts to do in everyday social interactions as well as more institutional and structural alongside government and other state institutions. So it's very aware of the need to not reproduce
the oppression.
The oppression.
Yeah.
The second endorsement is that this is something that can be applied to other contexts. And the fact that myself, Jessica, Emma, and Abiose are here to participate at the AMA conference is proof of that. A lot of the research questions here have been tailored to reflect, for example, Cameroon, where I did research in, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone, to talk about issues of ethnicity, religion, and language. So it's, I think in that regard, it pulls together a large number of interlocutors and agents for social restitution who can not only bring kind of a renewed enthusiasm to social restitution discussions in this context, but also provide a space and opportunity for us to learn and learn from one another. And on an African continent could enhance different bases for solidarity, such as Pan-Africanism and such. The one criticism, which is something that we've discussed and are actually looking to provide some sort of response to going forward, is that it's not quite clear what the basis for moral obligation is. So, for example, she's able to answer this question up until a certain point. So if you ask, why is it that we have an obligation to engage in acts and to engage in social restitution? She will give you the answer that social restitution damages our injustice damages our personhood. This understanding of personhood is based on the fact that what it means to be a person is that we are socially emergent beings in solidarity with one another because of the relationships we share. And acts of injustice damage these relationships. But even in the fact, so from that you get the answer that we should do something because we are affected by it. But we know many cases of people who engage in self-destructive behavior and see no reason to change
to stop that, yeah.
To stop what they're doing. So what can we say is definitively the moral basis of what generate these obligations? There's a question that is the answer to which doesn't quite come up clearly.
And Anya asks me all the time, and I go, yeah, no, I'm not sure. But it's one of the big questions that we answer all the time in moral psychology.
It's good. This is a gentle, even in the way she described the book, this is a nice way of asking people to engage in social. So in a way, you're preaching to people who you're assuming at the very least have a certain moral intuition which you can tap into. But if you're really going to motivate change from a wide audience, it's not clear what that moral base is.
Well, I think the revolutionaries must do that, right?
so it's true. So maybe that's one answer. Maybe one answer is that such a moral basis we're not going to come up with such a moral basis, and what's actually going to generate action is different pressures from different angles.
Yeah, maybe. Thanks, Anya. Emma?
So there's, Anya said a lot of what I wanted to say in my second comment, but maybe there's a soapie in South Africa called Isidingo, and there's one character, Cheryl de Villiers, who no matter what you do to her, comes back again, like over and over with another evil plot to kind of take over the world. And we used to, well, over the small world of the soapie, we used to joke in my, with another one of my professors that whiteness is like Cheryl de Villiers. Like no matter what you do to it, like there's a way in which it's kind of like this amoeba shape that kind of reforms and comes back and shapes into it. So, you know, it's a very similar, I think, critique to Anya's about, like you're assuming a goodness that I think a lot of white people want to be good moral people, and so you're providing a platform for the good moral people who want to continue being good moral people. But actually, that in some ways, that fact that white people could consider themselves to be good is a bit of a fallacy as well when you don't take into account that past history. So that's like one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot as well. But the other thing that I think is really, really important about the book in and of itself and about the project is about using qualitative research as an intervention. So about actually using the research process to educate, engage, and get people to reflect. And it was really clear to me when you were talking about it on the slides about there's some people who started out very kind of like they didn't know how to quite engage, but by the end of it, by giving them these tools, by giving them the possibility of labeling themselves, by giving them an opportunity to talk about these vignettes and obviously your engagement with that process and with them led a lot of people to a particular way of seeing, and that's a very powerful thing as well. So
it's also a critique of the fact that I was leading people, right? So you know, I just thought that there was a higher purpose here. Yeah. And that point that you're talking about is, I've heard that a lot. It's like, why would anybody want to relinquish their privilege and make restitution voluntarily without being compelled to do so by a court of law or down the barrel of a gun? Yeah, you know, I suppose. So.
Because there's a lot of people who want to be good people.
Also, like there's an assumption of a humanness of people that are being called out as not being human.
Yeah. And that was Helen's question 2 years ago. And I've said in the book that I think that this book is written for people who, of goodwill, who just need some help to take this next step, to really see and then to act on that seeing. And I think that that's, you know, some of people in South Africa, some of the people in the world, but it's certainly not everybody, and it's certainly not people with extremist views on either end of the spectrum, and both white South Africans and black South Africans. For many black South Africans, it's too little, too late, not enough, and for many white South Africans, it's like, why? I'm not complicit. I worked for what I had, and there's still very extreme racist views in South Africa. So.
You know,
Prof.
I got an email from somebody this morning. It's part of a response to what you were saying, but also part of my response.
Yeah, sure.
And about race in America. And I found myself saying, you know, as a South African, I'm led to say that these things come and go. This was a reference to Trump. And what I meant by that is that it's very important to think historically about these things and in the kind of like having the long view. And the long view suggests that there's actually a lot that we know about what it is that we owe to each other. And in the case of South Africa, what we know for sure are many of the ideas that ultimately found their way into the Constitution.
Yeah.
And you know, oftentimes we just take that for granted, that what is in the Constitution somehow, you know, came out of nowhere. I mean, I remember reading Andre Odendal's book, and he was quoting a line that was written in 1887, and that line is actually in our Constitution about respecting the religious difference and all of that. So we have a long, more than 100 years, 150 years of black people actually thinking and talking and revising and right, doing a lot of stuff. So there's a storage of ideas and values that is there that is hardly spoken about, partly because we don't do any very much in terms of studying black history and the history of ideas. And but also it does not mean that you reach a certain finality, you know, that there is a point where you can say that, you know what, we've reached our ideals, and our ideals, when we've reached them, they look like this. Right? There is no such state. And that brings me to the second point I want to make about what you're doing, which is that really what's important is not whether you're providing a manifesto. Or let me put it this way. A manifesto is important only as a mobilizing tool.
Okay.
People tend to think of a manifesto as a you know, we used to have this argument, you know, way back when I was an activist. We had something called the Azanian Manifesto, and then there was the Freedom Charter. And the Freedom Charter people were clear that this is what the end goals will be when we reach our freedom. The manifesto was talking in a very different language about how we are going to go about liberating ourselves and how we understand ourselves and all of that. But so what I'm saying is that that even when it comes to race, again, if you look at black history, there have been different conceptions of blackness over time. You know, and there was a time when blackness was like somebody who just phenotypically looks like me, right? And then there was a time when in South Africa blackness is coloreds and Indians and all of that, right? And people came to understand blackness to mean that. So in terms of what you are doing, what is interesting is that, again, if you look at this in a dynamic sense, is that white people in South Africa clearly are not looking at themselves in the way that they looked at themselves when Steve Biko was writing. And black people are not looking at themselves in exactly the same way, right? And this brings me to Fanon, right? I mean, one of the things that Fanon says is that about racism, right, is how he says, you know, racism never hardens. It kind of like morphs, right, into the cultural whole that it finds itself and mutates, right, and becomes part of the civic society, actually. It seems to me that the real contribution and the real challenge going forward is not what social restitution actually means as an end state. All right? It is about how do we think about social restitution. And it is when you frame it that way, right, that you are able to bring people into a conversation. And guess what happens? And now this comes back to the liberation struggle. I mean, it is amazing the kinds of stories I hear about how people were transformed to become members of the liberation movement. I'm talking about like privileged whites, right, who were transformed by sheer recruitment that the ANC or the PAC, they would recruit people who had no reason to risk their lives or to think differently. And somehow these people were transformed into revolutionaries, right? So what it is that you can do with human beings is also almost, it's almost like there's so much that you can do, right? So let me close by saying that, I mean, right now, we are in a particular global moment. And it's a global moment when whiteness is in a panic, like never before, right, in the past 400 years. Yeah. And what is happening is that, whether it's in England, France, America through Trump, right, there's this resurgence of white nationalism, right? But guess what? It cannot reassert itself quite the way it used to do before, right?
Because it's a resurgence of...
Even though you still have KKK and all of that, right? But it has to present itself in a new terrain. It has to operate on a new terrain, on a new cultural terrain, as Fanon would say, right? So what then happens, it has to gain some kind of respectability. And so what you have to be able to do is you have to be able to say, okay, how do we think about, right, how these folks are trying to deny the reality of race, right, or how they're trying to deny restitution. But that's as far as white folks go, right? So when I say that, you know, what you are doing is what Biko was doing, it's in terms of the process. It's not in terms of the actual, because times have changed.
The end, yeah.
Right? But it's how you engage with all kinds of obfuscations now that people have developed as a way of getting away from these issues. But equally challenging, which is I suppose is more my job than your job, right, is how do black people think about race?
Yeah.
Because because when Biko was saying that to white people, it was within a context of black people talking about race. And he was saying, we're talking about this issue, go talk about it, right? And then we'll find each other. But what's problematic now in South Africa and around the world, I think, is a failure, I think, to have a conversation about blackness and about race in the black world. What does it actually mean to be black right now in the world? Right? So, but that's my book, all right?
Yeah,
sure. But even so, right, it has to be part of a process about not so much what race is, as about how do we think about race. For me, that's the most important thing. You know, it's how do we get, and for me, that's the most important thing about Steve Biko. The most important thing about Steve Biko, or his best gift to me, is how do you think about society? Because it's how you think about the world that stops you from doing certain horrendous things, right? That leads you to appreciate that, this person, I need to listen to. I mean, you keep talking about dialogue. That's probably the most important part of this thing, is how do we get a dialogue and how do we shape that dialogue and talk, right, frankly and openly. For me, that is where we need to be. And this book becomes part of, right, that broader and larger conversation in South Africa and the world actually needs, right? But it's going to be made up of different components and different contributions.
Thanks, Marina.
Nice to see you.
And that's the one other thing for me that is a fear about the book, is that the dialogue might end up being quite superficial, and that's not what I'm intending at all. And it might be that talks about the actions so quickly rather than the way that we think about it. So that's a really good comment. Helen, I'm happy to hear whatever questions people have.
Got some questions. I'm excited by, I read it, wrote my comment. I was excited by this whole coming at it sideways, the idea of restitution and dialogue, the idea that, as Colette said, in one sense, the reality is the dialogue, that actually the act of dialoguing, the act of engaging with reflecting upon, reframing, finding a new way of conceptualizing anything in this form, an identity, and so on, is itself an act. And we tend to think of dialogue as something that's a kind of pre-act.
That has an end,
post-act,
yeah.
You know, you do it in order to get people to do something, or you do it after they've done something to kind of work out what it was. But actually, speaking as a cultural psychologist, I'd say the act of the dialogue itself is inherently an act. It isn't just a reflection upon action. And that's a very, very important theoretical point, I think, and something that we are taking seriously in social science, but I think it's something we need to take seriously also in education, because if you recognise the importance of the dialogue logic process, we're not just saying, okay, this is a means to an end. It is an end in itself.
Yeah.
It's quite a challenge. But that's not really my question. I have a question, particularly something that you were saying. You come from Sierra Leone, and you come from
Cameroon.
Cameroon.
Yes.
Okay. And of course, here people are black because they're African American. Is it helpful to think of blackness as something which is somehow universally
homogeneous?
The same? But I wouldn't say homogeneous, but is it the same to be black in an American context today, and to define what it means to be black, as it is to be black in Sierra Leone, in Cameroon, in Cape Town, or in London? I mean, is there a sense in which the almost the reification of blackness, it's obviously got a lot of psychological and political benefits, but is it actually the way forward for dealing with some of the kind of issues, that underlying issues we're talking about? I'm thinking particularly of the kind of work Sharlene knows that I was one of the supervisors of a student who was here 25 years ago, at the time that Mandela came to power, a guy called Salih Abrahams, who's actually Cape coloured, so he's actually Muslim. He was here as a doctoral student. He's not black in that sense. He was black in the sense that he was struggling with what it meant at the time that he was active he was a community activist during the pre-apartheid years. He then became an educator. He's now a senior administrator in a university in Cape Town. But, I mean, there, the struggles that he was talking, he interviewed intensively a dozen kids who were from Vandenberg, which of course is a mixed coloured and black township. And it was interesting how the different kids talked about the process of ending apartheid and what their role was and what they saw their role in the future to be. So I guess I'm asking partly about the homogeneity of blackness across countries, but also within South Africa, the homogeneity of non-whiteness. And I'm wondering if at no point, at least today, have you mentioned what used to be called the coloured population. And I'm wondering where they fit into the processes you're describing. So a lot of questions, I know, but they came to me as you're talking.
I'm happy to hear some more, and then we'll all try and answer them. Krista?
I'm very interested in this use of dialogue. For a decade, my work centered on engaging community in dialogue here in India. And that process was culturally very unfamiliar to people, and people were very skeptical about dialogue. And so I wonder, you've created this app, and it looks so wonderful. And so I wonder, do South Africans, is there a cultural norm that precipitates people viewing dialogue as a useful, important, valuable kind of enterprise to engage in? Is that just a cultural difference? Or is there also a struggle around persuading people to give it a try to actually speak with your neighbors?
So maybe I'll answer that one because it's a bit easier. So we're still really hugely divided in South Africa, geographically, physically. The apartheid terrain still exists. So it's really hard for people to just be together naturally and to talk. But on our university campuses, that is not the case. We are quite integrated on our university campuses. There's still lots of issues about whose culture predominates on university campuses, and so part of the
student protests at the University of Cape Town is the fact of institutional racism, that it's a colonial culture and all of that. But there are students there who could easily talk together, but who not particularly choosing to talk together right now, because I think many of them are saying, we've had enough of dialogue. We've had enough of being told what to do, and what we want to do is we want to think about what needs to be done, and we want to propose the agenda, and then we want to work towards the agenda. So I think while universities are quite integrated, they're also going to be one of the hardest places to have these dialogues. I don't know, what do you think, Leila, going forward?
Well, I wanted to respond to the issue of blackness.
Yeah.
You know, there is a, when you talk about identity, right, we talk about identity in different levels. And one form of identity, of course, is the ascription, right? You ascribe an identity. The way that people viscerally react to you, right? You could be from Sierra Leone or from Cameroon, right? Just your mere phenotypical, right, generates a certain response to you, right? And it's a response that has been manufactured and made natural over hundreds of years. So there's a certain inescapability, right, of blackness that has nothing to do with you or what you choose. It's how the wide world has created the image of the black. What does that actually invoke? What does that image invoke without even anybody opening their mouths? So there is that element of it, right? Now, what then happened, and of course, by the way, I mean, there's interesting work that has been done on this, that this phenomenon actually has taken different forms actually over the past 2,000 to 3,000 years. But it was only over the past 500 years that it has kind of taken the kind of modern systematic racism that we have come to know. But this, so there's this dimension to it. What then has happened is that there's been another kind of like self-description of people who go through those experiences, mainly slavery, colonialism, and apartheid, where people say, you know, if you look at this, right, if you look at this experience, right, it's an experience that is particular, right, to a certain group of people. And it's most common, and it's identified with a certain group of people. And those folks then gave political definitions to blackness, not merely as a question of skin color, right, but as a political definition. Now, that political definition will not be the same in all countries. In South Africa, it's a particularly political definition that includes coloreds and Indians. Even as coloreds and Indians no longer increasingly say, you know what, we're not black, we're coloreds and Indians. But there was a time when that was the identity.
The solidarity.
Identities are always right in this dynamic process. Now, in the United States, you'll find that it's mostly a phenotypical conception. So blackness is, what am I saying? I'm saying that blackness is a universal image and idea that has been constructed over hundreds of years. How black people have responded to it has taken on different forms in South Africa. I don't even know if you talk about blackness.
I was actually just going to comment because part of your question was regarding the homogeneity, whether race is a homogeneous experience. You were referring to how, for example, Sierra Leone and Cameroon experience.
I was asking, I didn't refer to it.
So I would say that in line with what Coletta was just saying now, is that I've never had to confront, as being in Cameroon, everyone else is mostly black. I've never had to confront blackness as a prime identity of my own. Like I was black, but it didn't mean much. But then, in retrospect, coming to South Africa, where as an identity, blackness is salient, I'm tempted to respond to your question by saying that there is, to some degree, a highly homogeneous experience of blackness in relation to whiteness, which is one of oppression, inferiority, and so on. Because when I was in Sharlene's class, for example, I never had to share experiences of what it means to be black, but one of the first things I remember was that even coming to University of Cape Town, I had subconsciously made, or even maybe to some degree consciously, made the decision to always pick a white tutor. Because, I mean, think about what that means. Because this is, on the one hand, I'm saying that I've never had to confront my blackness. But on the other hand, I'm coming to a different country, and I'm already loaded with expectations of other races, self-valuations as well, which nonetheless fit the general pattern of how blackness tends to play out in the world, how whiteness tends to play out in the world. So there's, even though it's not a salient identity in a context like Cameroon, there are a lot of other ways in which it nonetheless gets it diffuses and gets stored into you, and then at some point in the future you find yourself playing it out, and so on.
But I also wanted to say something about your question about the moral obligation and all of that, and I want to link it to this, what are the costs, right, of people? Why should people think that they should behave differently? I mean, it seems to me that, and I've been saying some of this in some of my columns back in South Africa, that it's just stupid. I mean, it's just plain stupid. And I don't mean that in a, I mean, if you are a responsible adult in South Africa right now, I mean, what is the percentage of the white population in South Africa?
8%.
8%, right? I mean, in 25 years, it's going to be, I don't know, 3%, you're right? So you have to just, from a commonsensical point of view, just think, what kind of country, right, is my granddaughter going to live in? Just from a purely human, commonsensical view. But what people tend to do is to think about, the here and now. And the absurdity and the stupidity of it, and just close on this, is how Vladimir Putin has become the great white hope in America. Because he's white. Because now there's this thing that this guy, right? This guy is not Barack Obama, right? This guy is standing up against the immigrants from the Muslim world, right? He is the one who's standing for whiteness, right? Now, it's all about skin color. It doesn't matter what this guy thinks. It doesn't matter how horrible he is in terms of his views and his behaviors. So racism can be quite self-destructive and stupid in that way, because all it appeals to.
But now, are you talking about Trump or Putin?
Both. They're friends, right?
I mean, I know they're friends.
Right? But what you're finding in Europe and in the United States is how Putin has become a great white hero.
Strange.
So
I think we should thank you. Let's move. Yes. Anybody else got questions? It's been very exciting, and I hope the book does extremely well. Has it been covered in the press yet?
I think it's coming. It's starting. So we had a conference a couple of weeks ago, and there was quite a bit of press from that. Okay. But I think the thing that is happening, and to answer your question, Krista, is people are starting dialogue groups. And so I keep seeing on my Facebook timeline, we've got one starting, in a little suburb down the road, and then somebody starting it in a kind of a community that has a potential for black and white people to be together a bit more easily. And so that's what I'm getting, and I like to hear that, because I think Claudia's right. It's the thinking about the notion of restitution that for me is really important.
Can I just tell a story which totally personal story, contextualizes a lot of things for me. When I was a child, I lived in Australia, and we came back to England when I was 13. Australia at that time was a completely white country, except for the indigenous population, called Aboriginals, they called them. I never met because of the, as it happened because of the Suez crisis, the ship we were going home on, rather than just going up through the Suez Canal, had to go south. We stopped in Cape Town. And we had no preparation at all for what we were going to see there. My parents were good liberals, but they were not very politically sophisticated. I had one day in Cape Town in 1956, and that every moment of that day remains in my mind, and every moment of that day has fired my political convictions ever since, because as a 13-year-old girl with all the usual things that 13-year-olds girls have, but no history of political awareness, and no history at all of any interracial experiences, and walking through Cape Town for one day in 1956 brought home to me absolutely everything that was happening. And when I visited District 6 Museum, when I went back to South Africa again 50 years later, I wept because it was just like it had been in the streets when I was there. So I'm saying that, you know, in a sense, for me, that my whiteness was brought home to me, heavily imbued with morality, by just spending a day in Cape Town when I was 13 years old. So it's the sort of thing, you know, I'm kind of echoing it's the kind of flip side of what you're saying, that you can encounter your ethnicity or whatever as an accident of what you're exposed to, without having any kind of preparatory expectations. Like you say, you as a Cameroonian person, you didn't experience in your Cameroonian life the things which you came to understand and appreciate in Cape Town. So I try to tell that story because it's a very powerful experience, and it also, I think it's important how children are so affected often by these things. But anyway, Sharlene, thank you so much.
No, thank you.